Let's take an example of an reading comprehension passage from CAT 2004. I've also included this passage in the attachments alongside. So if you want, you can probably download the attachment first and then try it out on your own before looking at this video. So let's start off. We are saying the author says that the painter is now free to paint anything that he chooses. There are scarcely any forbidden subjects, and today everyone is prepared to admit that a painting of some fruit can be as important as a painting of a hero dying. The impression did as much as anybody to win this previously unheard of freedom for the artist. Yet, by the next generation, painters began to abandon the subject altogether and began to paint abstract pictures. And today, the majority of the pictures painted are abstract. So, what does the author want to say in the first paragraph? Probably we can just write this down. He wants to say that the painter is free to paint any subject. There are hardly any forbidden subjects, and this was won by this freedom won by impressionists, and today the majority of the pictures painted are abstract. So today majority are abstract. As you must have seen in earlier videos, the reason why we do this is to help us comprehend the passage better. Of course, as you get better and better at it, you can forego writing down the important points, and rather you can just keep it in your mind. Alright, let's move on to the second paragraph. The second paragraph says, is there a connection between these two developments? Has art gone abstract because the artist is embarrassed by his freedom? Is it that because he is free to paint anything, he doesn't know what to paint? Apologists for the abstract art often talk of it as the art of maximum freedom. But could this be the freedom of the desert island? It would take too long to answer these questions properly. I believe there is a connection. Many things have encouraged the development of abstract art. Among them has been the artist's wish to avoid the difficulties of finding subjects when all subjects are equally possible. So the author starts off with asking whether there is a connection between these two developments. So basically the development, the pronoun these in this paragraph indicates the development in sense of the freedom won by the impressionists for the subject, and yet by the next generation painters began to abandon the subject. So these are the two developments he talks about, that is freedom of the subject and abandoning the subject. And he goes on to say, has art gone abstract because the artist is embarrassed by this freedom? Is it that because he is free to paint anything, he doesn't know what to paint? And so on, so on. And ultimately he believes that there is a connection. And he goes on to say many things have encouraged the development of abstract art, and among them has been the difficulties. Artists wish to avoid the difficulties of finding subjects when all subjects are equally possible. So basically, in this paragraph, in paragraph 2, he tries to find a connection, and he believes that there is a connection. And he also says that the artist's wish is to avoid the difficulties of finding subjects when all are equally possible. And so abstract because avoid difficulty in finding the subject. Alright, let's move on to his third paragraph now. I raise the matter now because I want to draw attention to the fact that the painter's choice of a subject is a far more complicated question than it would at first seem. A subject does not start with what is put in front of the easel or with something which the painter happens to remember. A subject starts with the painter deciding that he would like to paint such and such because for some reason or the other he finds it meaningful. A subject begins when the artist selects something for special mention. What makes it special or meaningful may seem to the artist to be purely visual, its colors or its form. When the subject has been selected, the function of the painting itself is to communicate and justify the significance of that selection. So in this case, in this paragraph, the author wants to talk about how and why the painter wants to select the subject. So what he says is that the choice of the subject is a far more complicated question, and the subject does not start with what is front and put of the easel or what the painter happens to remember. So if we can write third paragraph. So subject is not what the painter remembers, In fact, the subject starts with the painter deciding he would like to paint such and such because he finds it meaningful. Okay, so meaningful is the reason and not what the painter remembers. Alright. And the author further says a subject begins when the artist selects something for special mention. When the subject has been selected, the function is to purely communicate. Okay, so after selection, so painting is used for communicating the subject. Alright, let's move on to the next paragraph. The fourth paragraph says, thus for a painting to succeed, it is essential that the painter and his public agree about what is significant. The subject may have a personal meaning for the painter or the individual spectator, but there must also be the possibility of their agreement on its general meaning. It is at this point that the culture of the society and period in question precedes the artist and his art. Renaissance art would have meant nothing to the Aztecs and vice versa. If to some extent a few intellectuals can appreciate them both today, it is because their culture is an historical one. Its inspiration is history, and therefore it can conclude within itself in principle, if not in every particular and all known developments to date. So in this case, the author talks about the painting and the agreement of the painting with the public. So he says that the subject may have a meaningful personal meaning for the painter or the individual spectator, but there must be some possibility of agreement. So there must be some, we go back, there must be some possibility of agreement on the general meaning. And it is at this point that the culture of the society in the period in question precedes the artist and his art. And the Renaissance art would have meant, and so on, so on. He goes on to talk about history, but we will not go further into detail about these points. In case there is a question on these points, then we will come back and check these points again. Alright, so in a reading comprehension passage, it's not necessary that you understand each and every word which is mentioned. All you need to know is where that particular area or topic is mentioned. And in case there is a question on that particular topic, you can always come back and revisit that subject from the reading comprehension as long as you know where it is located. Alright, so if I have to summarize paragraph 4, I will say that the subject may have a personal meaning for the painter or the individual spectator, but there must be possibility on agreement. So possibility on agreement between painter and public. And this depends on culture. Okay, so this is the gist of the passage, gist of this paragraph rather, that the painting, that there must be an agreement between the painter and the public, and then this depends on the culture and the time period in which the artist is drawing the particular painting. Alright, let's move on to the next paragraph. The next paragraph says, when a culture is secure and certain of its values, it presents its artists with subjects. The general agreement about what is significant is so well established that the significance of a particular subject accrues and becomes traditional. This is true, for instance, of reeds and water in China, of the nude body in Renaissance, of the animal in Africa. Furthermore, in such cultures, the artist is unlikely to be a free agent. He will be employed for the sake of particular subjects, and the problem, as we have just described it, will not occur to him. Alright, so basically here we are saying that when a culture is secure, and certain of its values, it presents its artists with subjects. So when a culture is secure, the artist is automatically presented with subjects. Right? So the general agreement about what is significant and so on accrues and becomes traditional. So, and he goes on to further give examples of China, Renaissance, and animals in Africa, and so on. And furthermore, he says that in such cultures, the artist is unlikely to be a free agent. He'll be employed for the sake of particular subjects. So basically, in this paragraph, he talks about culture being secure. If the culture is secure, then basically it presents its artists with subjects, and there is a general agreement. So there is a general agreement on the subject, and so on. And in this case, artist is unlikely to be an artist, so artist will not be free. Alright, so this is the gist of the paragraph again, that when the culture is secure, there is a general agreement on what the subject is, and hence the artist is not free to paint whatever he wishes to. Alright, let's move on to the next paragraph. Paragraph 6 says that when a culture is in a state of disintegration or transition, the freedom of the artist increases, but the question of subject matter becomes problematic for him. He himself has to choose for society. This was at the basis of all the increasing crisis in European art during the 19th century. It's too often forgotten how many of the art scandals of that time are provoked by the choice of subject. Jericho, Courbet, Romeo, Degas, and Van Gogh, and so on. Again, we are not very concerned about the names of the artists. In case there is a question on the names of the artists, we can always come back and check. But in this paragraph, the author wants to say that he makes a comparison rather with paragraph 5. So in paragraph 5, he talked about what happens when a culture is secure. In this case, he is talking about when a culture is in a state of disintegration or transition, the freedom of the artist increases and he himself has to choose the subject for the society. So basically, he says that unsecure culture, so free to choose the subject, and the question on the subject matter becomes problematic because he himself has to choose for society. This was the basis of all increasing crisis and so on. So crisis in 19th century. Alright, so this is the gist of the paragraph. Again, let's move on to the last paragraph now. So he concludes by saying that by the end of the 19th century, there were, roughly speaking, two ways in which the painter could meet this challenge of deciding what to paint and so choosing for society. Either he identified himself with the people and so allowed their lives to dictate the subjects to him, or he had to find the subjects within himself as a painter. By people, I mean everybody except the bourgeois. Many painters did, of course, work of the bourgeois according to their copybook of approved subject, but all of them filling the salon in the Royal Academy year after year are now forgotten, buried under the hypocrisy of those they serve so sincerely. Alright, so in this case, he continues with the previous paragraph and he talks about how the painter chooses a subject when the culture is insecure. So basically, he says that there are two ways in which the painter could meet this challenge of deciding what to paint and so choosing for society. So paragraph 7, he says there are two ways. One is that he identifies himself with the people and so allowed their lives to dictate the subjects to him. So identifies with people and based on lives. He identifies himself with people and allowed their lives to dictate the subjects to him, or he had to find the subjects within himself as a painter or within himself. So two ways in which he could decide the subject. And the paragraph concludes by saying that many painters did the work of the bourgeois according to the copybook of approved subjects, but all of them are now forgotten. So basically, the artists who identified with people except the bourgeois and painted are now probably remembered, and people who simply painted what the bourgeois wanted are now forgotten. That is what this entire paragraph wants to say. Alright, let's do a quick summary of whatever we have written down. So in the first paragraph, we talked about how the painter is free to paint any subject today, and the freedom was won by impressionists, and today majority of the paintings are abstract. Paragraph 2 says that the author believes that there is a connection between the developments which we talked about in the first paragraph, and that in abstract paintings, they avoid the difficulty in finalizing the subject. In the third paragraph, we talked about not what the painter remembers, but what is more meaningful to him. So the painter will paint the subject based on not what he remembers, but what is meaningful to him. And he has to communicate that subject. In the next paragraph, we talked about how there is a possibility on agreement between the painter and the public, and this depends on culture, and we also talked about historical context and so on. In the next paragraph, we talked about what happens when a culture is secure, that there is a general agreement on what the subject is, and that the artist is not free to paint what he wants. In the next paragraph, we talked about how when the culture is insecure, the author is free to choose, the painter is rather free to choose whatever subject he wants, and because of which there was a crisis in the 19th century. The last paragraph, we talked about how the ways in which a painter could decide what he wanted to paint. There were two reasons which were given. The first one stated that one way for him was to identify with people and allow their lives to dictate what he wanted, and the second one was to look within himself and so on. So the idea behind writing down these points is that a lot of people, a lot of aspirants have this problem of forgetting what they read at the beginning once they reach the end. Now, writing down points ensures that you have written down the points and you can just rush through them quickly after you finish the paragraph, and this will help you recollect the points which you would probably forget if you just read it without noting down. Alright, let's look at the questions now. The first question says, when a culture is insecure, the painter chooses his subject on the basis of. Alright, so when a culture is insecure. Now clearly there were two paragraphs, if you remember, on the culture being insecure. The last one and the second last one. So the answer has to lie in those two paragraphs. Let's take the answer options also. So when a culture is insecure, the painter chooses his subject on the basis of the prevalent style in the society of his time, its meaningfulness to the painter, what is put in front of the easel, and past experience and memory of the painter. Now if we go back, in this case, in the last paragraph, we talked about how the painter chooses the subject. There are 2 points which we talked about, that is allowing the lives of people to dictate the subject or finding the subjects within himself. So these are the 2 points, and any option which talks about either of these 2 points will be the answer. So in this case, the first one says the present style in the society of his time. Not really. This would not be the answer, because this is in fact the case when a culture is secure. Its meaningfulness to the painter. Yes, this could be the answer, because its meaningfulness is talking about how he has to find the subjects within himself as a painter. So if he has to find the subjects within himself as a painter, he would choose the subject on the basis of what is its meaningfulness to himself. Let's look at option 3. What is put in front of the easel? Again, this is wrong, because this doesn't fall in under those two categories. And the fourth one says past experience and memory of the painter. Again, this is wrong, because he has to look within himself. It doesn't mention anywhere that he has to go back and look at his own life and paint from his own experiences. Alright, so in this case, we can mark this. So 2 will be the right answer. The second question says, in the sentence, I believe there is a connection. What two developments is the author referring to? Again, we talked about this when we were actually examining the paragraph, the second paragraph. So I believe there is a connection. What two developments is the author referring to? So let's go back again to the second paragraph. So he says, has art gone abstract because the artist is embarrassed by his freedom? Is it that because he is free to paint anything, he doesn't know what to paint, and so on? So is there a connection between these two developments? The moment you see this pronoun, then you have to go back and check what that pronoun is referring to. So this is a demonstrative pronoun, and here it is talking about that the Impressionists won the freedom for the artist, and yet by the next generation, the painters began to abandon the subject altogether and began to paint abstract pictures. So basically, we are talking about winning the freedom to paint anything, and then in the next case, we are talking about abandoning the subject altogether. So basically, again, if you look at the second paragraph, it says, is it that because he is free to paint anything, he doesn't know what to paint? Apologists for abstract art often talk about it as the art of maximum freedom. So it would take too long to answer these questions. I believe that there is a connection. So basically, he talks about how because the artist has so much freedom, he has abandoned the subject totally and started painting abstract pictures. So any option which talks about this would be the answer. Again, let's go back. So here we are talking about in the sentence, I believe there is a connection. What two developments is the author referring to? So here we say the painters using a dying hero and using a fruit as a subject of a painting. This is clearly not an answer. He's just simply taking the example which was mentioned and using that as the developments. Okay, so this is incorrect. The second one says growing success of painters and an increase in abstract form. Now increase in abstract forms is right, but then there is nothing mentioned about growing success of painters. Again, so this will be wrong. Third one says artists gaining freedom to choose subjects and abandoning subjects altogether. This is clearly the answer. Again, as we saw, artists gain freedom to choose their subjects, and then in the next development, they totally abandoned the subjects and went for an abstract form. So these are the two developments which the author is referring to. The last one says rise of Impressionists and an increase in abstract form. So rise of Impressionists is not really what we are talking about. All we said in the passage was that Impressionists won the freedom to choose subjects, and we are not talking about rise of Impressionists. So this is clearly the wrong option. Alright, let's move on to the next one. Which of the following is not necessarily among the attributes needed for a painter to succeed? So in this case, we are saying which of the following is not necessarily among the attributes needed for a painter to succeed. Let's look at the options. The painter and his public agree on what is significant. The painter, if painting is able to communicate and justify the selection of its subject selection. The subject has a personal meaning for the painter, and the painting of subjects is inspired by historical developments. Alright, let's go back and check on what would be among the attributes needed for a painter to succeed. So if we actually talk about this, the agreement about, or the success was mentioned in this paragraph. So here we are saying that thus for a painting to succeed, it is essential that the painter and the public agree about what is significant. So the first option mentioned that it is essential that the painter and the public agree about what is significant. So this is clearly something which is needed, and hence this can't be the answer. Remember that the question asks us that which of the following is not necessary among the attributes. So this is a necessary attribute, and hence one will be wrong. Alright. Next, move on to the next one. The painting is able to communicate and justify the significance of its subject selection. So in the previous paragraph, we talked about how when the subject has been selected, the function of the painting, when the subject has been selected, the function of the painting itself is to communicate and justify the significance. Clearly, this is one important aspect of the painting being successful, and hence this also can't be the answer. Let's look at the third one. Third one says the subject has a personal meaning for the painter. Now this is mentioned here. The subject may have a personal meaning for the painter or individual spectator, but there must also be the possibility of their agreement on its general meaning. Now what we are saying is that the subject may have some personal meaning for the painter, but apart from this, there must also be the possibility of the agreement on its general meaning. So clearly, even if there is a personal meaning for the painter, it's not necessary that the painting will be successful. Rather, there should be a possibility of the agreement on its general meaning. And hence, this, that is answer option 3, is among the attributes which is not needed for a painter to succeed, and hence option 3 will be the answer. Alright, let's move to the next one. In the context of the passage, which of the following would not be true? Painters decided subjects based on what they remembered from their lives. So in this case, the first option talks about painters deciding subjects based on what they remember from their lives. Now in the passage, nowhere was it mentioned that they decided subjects based on what they remembered. Rather, we talked about the meaningfulness to the different two people and to themselves and so on. But it was not based on what they remembered from their own lives. So this seems to be a wrong option. Anyway, let's move on. The second one says painters of reeds and water in China face no serious problem of choosing a subject. And this is clearly mentioned in the passage in the paragraph where we talked about the culture being secure. If I just go back, in paragraph 5 we talked about the culture being secure, and hence there was an agreement on the subject, and this was true of reeds and water in China. So this option is clearly mentioned in the context of the paragraph, and hence this can't be the right answer. Third one says the choice of subject was a source of scandals in 19th century European art. Again, we talked about this in the 6th paragraph, that it is too often forgotten how many of the art scandals of that time were provoked by the choice of subject, and hence this will be wrong. So this is also mentioned in the paragraph, and hence this answer option can't be right. The last one says agreement on the general meaning of a painting is influenced by culture and historical context. Again, this is also mentioned in paragraph 4. We talked about culture, and we talked about how there is a meaning, how Renaissance paintings would not have any meanings to the Aztecs, and hence culture and history determine the meaningfulness of that particular painting. So again, agreement on the general meaning is influenced by culture and historical context will again be something which is mentioned in the passage and will be right, and hence the only thing which is not mentioned in the passage will be option 1, which is the right answer. Let's move on to the last question. Which of the following views is taken by the author? The author says the more insecure a culture, the greater is the freedom of the artist. Alright, so again we talked about secure and insecure cultures, and if you remember, in the secure culture we talked about how secure culture there is a general agreement on what is the subject, and hence there is no freedom of the artist. In the case of an insecure culture, it is just the opposite. The author has a lot of freedom to paint whatever he wants, and he chooses a subject based on meaningfulness to himself and based on the lives of people. So clearly something which talks about either secure and no freedom, or insecure and freedom will be the answer. Let's look at the options. The more insecure a culture, the greater the freedom of the artist. Now this is clearly right. We talked about how when a culture is insecure, the greater will be the freedom of the artist. And hence 1 will be the option.